Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Josh Baum, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Today on the pod, we spoke with Charlotte Duval-Lantoine about the key factors driving the CAP's recruitment and retention crisis and how the crisis can be addressed. Charlotte is the Vice President, as well as a Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, as well as Triple Helix's Executive Director and Gender Advisor. Charlotte is also a PhD student at Deakin University, where she studies the influence the culture of the Canadian Army had on the killings of Somali civilians during Operation Deliverance. This is the Expert Series. Charlotte, thanks for joining the CDA podcast. It's great to have you on. And before we start, I'd just like to congratulate you as you were the recent recipient of our Nicolas Godard Award this year at the previous Ottawa conference. So, congratulations on your award, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks so much for the congratulations and for having me today, Josh. It's a pleasure.
As you know, today we'll be talking about recruitment and retention, starting off a bit broad and then going a little granular from there. Speaking about all of the issues inherent in the recruitment and retention crisis. So I guess this is a bit of a scene setter for our audience and maybe people who aren't so familiar with the topic. I'm wondering if you could break it down for us, start with a scene setter, and maybe you could explain the nature of this crisis and then maybe some of the key fundamental challenges as well as how you think we got there. So that's a tall order, but I'll let you take a stab at it.
Oh yeah. I'm a historian by background, so I'm gonna start a little bit with some history. So right now, everyone in your audience will know that we have a massive gap in terms of personnel to fill. People will blame the situation to the pandemic, but the pandemic accelerated the crisis, but it had been a long time in the making. As recently as 2016, the Office of the Auditor General was putting down some warning signs because the military kept on under recruiting for the pace of attrition, sorry, and they were also the military was not able to fill what it needed in terms of people. So that was going on for at least 8 years and counting. But these are problems that every time you talk to people who started their career in the military during the 80s, 90s, these have been issues of the military. Even in times of downsizing and budget cuts, the military was having issues filling its position and meeting what we know as the strategic intake plan, which is a number of service member the military wants to recruit in order to fill its needs. It was always feeling short. And we can talk about the situation in 2025. For the first time in decades, the military finally met its strategic intake plan. So where are we today? Things are doing better, but I think there are still a lot of misconception about what the problems are and how the military needs to deal with them.
Well, thanks for that scene setter, Charlotte. Is the recruitment and retention crisis something that's unique to Canada, or are there other periods of history or even contemporary areas we can look at? Like, are there other countries in the world right now that are also struggling with recruitment and retention crises? And if so, are the issues similar in Canada and in these other countries?
But no, Canada is not the only country to be dealing with this crisis, and it's something that we hear a lot about. But what I would say is that the nature of the crisis is quite different. And I will remember vividly one of my trips to France in 2022, where there were actual ads in the subway and on the radio for the to join the French Air Force as a pilot. So you know that a country is quite in dire need of people when you see advertising like this in public and in the subway or public transportation. Um, but what most countries have as an issue is an attraction problem. For example, the United States military right now is having some issues with attraction. And that is also because about a quarter of the American population is not eligible join the American military because of physical standards, because of education, because of immigration status, etc. But Canada does not necessarily have this problem, and this is where we find ourselves lost if we just try to do a one-to-one comparison with our allies, because the nature of the crisis is quite different.
What would you say are some of the institutional barriers that are limiting the military's ability to translate public interest into service, into actual recruitment?
So the thing is that there is public interest to joining the military. So this year, we finally met our strategic intake plan for the first time in decade. And last fiscal year, 2023 to 2024, about 70,000 Canadians, including permanent residents, have tried to apply to the Canadian military. It was almost double to the previous year, being 2022, 2023. So attraction is not an issue. The issue is what we will call throughputs. The military is not resourcing its recruitment pipeline appropriately. So what has been happening is that there had not been any modernization of the recruitment process. Everything was analog. Um, the tests and the standards on which people had to go through in order to join the military were outdated and required sometimes presence in person, which increase some barriers because, sometimes people have to work and cannot necessarily have time to go or lived in remote areas. So so those were big issues, and that was a problem that was flagged by the Auditor General back in 2016, saying that the military was actually recruiting for what it was capable to process and not for the number of people that it needed. And so that meant that there was a gap in the ability of recruiting people that has come home to roost for Canada, especially when the pandemic required the military to drop significantly its recruiting capacities, and then its attrition levels arose.
Maybe you can get into some of the ways that we could maybe ameliorate some of these institutional barriers, and as you said, start modernizing the recruitment process.
So the good news is that the military has been working towards that modernization. So they put in place a portal. They did look into removing certain barriers. So one of them was the CFAT, which is the aptitude test. They realized that when people were applying to join the military, they would drop significantly if they had to sit that test. And while people are thinking that it's gonna lower the standards for the military, it's actually pushing, like increasing slightly the risk and pushing potential attrition down the pipeline. But what they're doing now is an assessment of the person's CV, very much like looking into their background, whether or not, if they have a degree, if they have a certain formal education, and kind of assessing someone's occupation based on that, which the CFAT was for. Also, what is not very well known is that new recruits still have to pass an aptitude test once they are in basic training. But the thing is, because they're there physically at the recruit schools, then it's easier to manage the attrition in just sitting the test altogether. It increases the attrition slightly because, well, some people might not meet the aptitude standards for the military, but the lowering of standard at the beginning, at the application phase, translates to a higher attrition at the recruit school. So it is not an across the board lowering of standards. Then obviously something that was mentioned a lot was the issue of clearance for service members, especially those who have permanent residency. Um, there has been a memorandum of understanding being signed with Immigration Recruit Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and also for those who have not had to go through the immigration system or are familiar with the immigration system, when you apply for permanent residency, you actually go through something very similar to what Canadians have to go through to obtain reliability status. And oftentimes, people with permanent residency have had it for less than 5 years. So there needed to be an improvement of processes because otherwise, it would take over 2 years for those people to obtain their clearance necessary to join basic training. Now, there is a probation phase, which means that you can do basic training without having that reliability status, which I think is a good approach to very much managing that risk. Um, so those are the efforts being put in place, and I find them excellent. Now the real question is resourcing and doing occupation by occupation analysis of what is going on. Um, the military has been doing a little bit better at outlining what kind of career you can do in the military because we know that Gen Z tends to look for more diversity in their career. But I think that we're not going far enough into prioritizing certain advertisement, especially for the Navy. The Navy is struggling very much. The Navy is one of the only, is actually the only service that did not meet its strategic intake plan this year. And that is a serious issue, especially in light of fleet transition. So, are you putting in place certain incentives? Are you maybe um, do more targeted recruitment? The main occupations that are experiencing shortages right now are related to what in civilian society we call the trades. So electrician, plumber, etc. Like why don't are you doing proper recruitment in trade school? Those are questions that we need to ask ourselves. But then I think that we need to think about what is it that is not making the military attractive to the people that need to occupy those trades, that we need to occupy those trades. Is it moving too often? Is it a salary being too low? Is it life ownership is not that attractive to people? Which ones are misconceptions and which ones are reality that we need to proper address? And the problem is that every time we have this conversation, we tend to cling to an old idea of the military where we say, oh, we're lowering standards. But, when we think about World War II, most of the people who fought valiantly in my home country of France were people that were conscripted and enlisted in the Canadian military, not conscripted, sorry, who were volunteers for the military to go abroad. They were not service member by background. And the physical test was, can you run properly? Like, do you have healthy teeth? So the standards were very different. And so we need to also ask ourselves, is the idea that we have right now of military service one in line with what our population can offer, and two, are we too rigid? Are we too much expecting a military strength that is very much like what we see in Hollywood movies? And are we also too much relying on what was needed in Afghanistan? But right now, are we actually are our recruitment standards and our recruitment pipeline and the way that we're approaching attracting Canadians, is it very much in line with the war that we're expecting today? Like right now, we know that the main determining factor is math. So when we need math, do we get to be choosing beggars when it comes to recruitment and retention?
Well, Charlotte, you bring up a lot of very fascinating points here that I want to touch up on um,
Mhm.
in a few moments. The first thing that comes to mind, you've outlined a lot of reasons why the recruitment and retention crisis is manifesting as it is. You did bring up the issue of salaries, and this is something I see written about in the media quite frequently. Um,
Mhm.
if what I myself am not even aware, but like what is a starting salary for someone thinking of joining the CAF? I suppose it depends on where they're going, and if salaries were higher than they would we see more people joining, or are there other sort of are there other considerations for people as well? And building on that, I suppose housing. Canada obviously is in a housing crisis, and that makes it difficult for families and individuals to move around. To what extent are these two factors significantly impacting the crisis?
So, knowing about starting salary in the military is quite difficult because it depends on your trade, on whether you join as a private or an officer. Um, the way that the military advertised it, and it's not very accurate, it's about $30,000, but there are various benefits that you can enjoy. And so it's very difficult to, like, in actual money, like you would calculate in civilian society, it is quite difficult. And also you are almost guaranteed a salary raise every year. The challenge that we have in terms of money in the military, the first one I would say is moving around, and the difficulty that it is for a military partner to have their own salary because they're moving around, right? We know, especially right now, the job market is not what it was during the pandemic, and so hopping from job to job is quite a difficult thing to do. And we also know that employers tend to consider job hopping quite a red flag. There is an adaptation now because Gen Z is big on job hopping. But when you do that from province to province, and that you are almost guaranteed to leave your job every 2 to 3 years, it can become a red flag. So you find yourself with a lot of families that are not able to have a two income salary, which is where the affordability issues really kick in. And so it leads very much to the other point that you mentioned, and also my skepticism right now around the raising salary platforms that the different parties are bringing right now, is because I think, yes, consider raising the salaries, but we're very much treating it as a one and done situation because there are larger structural issues. As you mentioned, housing access and housing affordability in Canada is an issue for all Canadians. Now imagine that you have to face that problem every 2 to 3 years. That creates massive barriers to find affordable housing for Canadians because every time you vacate a unit, landlords are able to raise the prices quite significantly rather than if you were living in somewhere rent control. And because you're moving to so often, well, buying a house and getting a mortgage is not necessarily the best idea, especially when interests are high. And then the question of salary is, well, can you put a down payment in the first place? So those are difficulties. But while increasing salary would kind of help with that, well, it's not gonna fix the access to housing. It's gonna fix the fact that military housing is there's not enough. The units are not adapted properly for families. It's mostly bachelors or one bedroom units, and some of them have not been renovated since the Cold War, and they need to be market price. So imagine yourself paying for whatever you pay in Vancouver right now, but then you have something that dates back to the 1960s, 1970s, and that has not been renovated ever since. You don't want to pay for that. You'd rather pay the same price, but for something better, right? But that creates difficulties on that front. Then the other, I think, affordability issue that is kind of connected, but we don't really make the link to necessarily, it's healthcare. Because you're moving all the time, access to a primary physician is difficult. Mind you, I've been in Canada for 10 years and I've never had a family doctor because I moved too often. But now, like even 6 years in Ottawa, I still don't have access to one. Now, again, imagine that if you need to move all the time. There are programs within the military called Seamless Canada that is where the military is actually trying to partner with provinces to ease access to healthcare for service members. But I do think that it should actually come from the Minister of National Defense or cabinet directly. So yeah, salary is an issue. I think that we could increase the salary of our service members, but there are structural issues that go around that. One last thing that I want to mention because it made the news about 2 to 3 years ago, that's the housing differential. So, service members are able to get support for their rent and their mortgage based on where they're based. It used to be a lot higher when it was the post living differential, which was very much more related to overall spending to live. So it went beyond housing. But with the implementation of the housing differential, there has been a massive increase for massive decrease for some people in terms of support. And I have seen people, because of that change in policy and that change in budget, finding themselves in a difficult financial situation. And oftentimes, career management is not in line with an assessment of what the person can afford or not.
But building on this, Charlotte, I note reading through your work that a lot of mid-level individuals in the forces leave around mid-career.
Yeah.
Maybe you could build on what you've just been saying and maybe discuss why you think this is the case.
So, affordability is an issue. Uh, there's also the fact that affordability piece ties also into people's family. Like oftentimes the stories that I hear is, while my kids are about to enter high school and I don't want them to move every year or every 2 years during high school, especially when their kids are approaching grade 12, they want to offer them stability before going into university. Um, Another thing that we cannot necessarily deny is the issue of, are people happy with the military? And that becomes a lot murkier. But to give you just insights into that, I attended a presentation back in October of this year that showed that 42% of service members were unhappy with their career management, with 30% of those people considering that a retention issue. That because of their career management, they thought of leaving the CAF. And so oftentimes what you hear is that people often feel like meat in a meat grinder. And that's a quote that I'm using from one of the research that I've done on veteran transition to civilian life, that people feel like that the mercy of the organization and sometimes leaving is a way for them to gain back control on their life. And then there are often some um, leadership climate issues that might drive people out. So the picture is quite complex. What you usually find in data is that it's not just one factor. There are a lot of push and pull, but affordability, stability, and meaningful work without any difficulties and toxic circumstances are usually the big pieces that you hear. And then it's not including work-related injuries, which women are more likely to get, etc. So it's a complicated picture, but those are the main factors that I've encountered.
Charlotte, we discussed earlier in the conversation some manner in which the government is already addressing the recruitment and retention crisis, and we've discussed some further measures they could take. Of course, the DPU mentions it. There was also the Reconstitution Directive, which laid out some themes to address the personnel crisis. From your observations and from your time studying this issue, are you hopeful that in the near to medium term we can overcome the recruitment and retention crisis?
For the recruitment issue, I'm quite optimistic. I wish there had been more about resourcing recruitment and personnel aspects of the military in the platforms or even in the DPU or on staff. Uh, but you can see the military one really pushing forward on that front. Even the individual services are trying to do better. For the example, the Naval Experience Program put in place by Vice Admiral Topsy. So on that front, I think we can be optimistic that the military is trying really hard. Retention has become a murkier issue, and I really want us to get away from is just a money problem and we cannot compete with the private sector. People do care about affordability, but the people who want to maximize their income and people in the military do not necessarily, or people interested in service do not necessarily overlap. Like some people work in non for profit, even though this is not where they will make the highest income. So I think we need to think about those issues more this way and also include climate and satisfaction of service as and I mean climate like organizational climate rather than climate for climate change as part of this piece. I think that it is very underrated. And finally, for very specialized occupation like pilots or trades, etc., well, once you attain a certain level in the Canadian military, you do not necessarily do that role anymore. And one thing that I know about pilots, whether they're in civilian life or in the military, is that that's what they want to do with their career. So sometimes they leave because they know that they won't be a pilot anymore, they won't fly anymore, or they will be doing another job. Some people want to stay where they are and they want to continue doing the job that they are doing. So more flexibility on that piece can go a long way for service members to stay. And one final piece to get into more the culture and gender aspect of the conversation, it sounds very silly at the surface level, but it's equipment adapted to women and the physiology. Women are more likely to suffer from musculoskeletal injuries than men in the Canadian military. And part of the problem is boots, rucksack, helmets do not fit them. The military is finally looking into procuring flak jackets for women. Women have been in combat arms since '89, and the issue of rucksack and flak jacket has been flagged by service women since at least the 1970s. We need to get onto this so that we can manage injuries that service members and especially service women are facing.
Charlotte, thanks for joining me for a great conversation today, taking some time out of your busy day. We didn't get through even half the questions I had planned, but hopefully that just means you can come on the podcast in the future and we can go a bit deeper. That said, before we wrap up, I just wanted to give you some space to address any final thoughts you might have, or if you think there's something important here that you think might be important for our audience to understand that we maybe just glossed over, maybe that you want to reiterate.
Yeah, quickly, I think that the biggest piece that we need to address today in terms of military recruitment retention is that this is not just a Canadian military issues. I think that the future Minister of National Defense, the current and future premiers of each provinces and territories have a lot of power in changing some things. For example, the housing agency that is quite behind on renovating and building new housing is bound by policies that are dictated by a treasury board. And instead of having the military negotiate or the housing agency negotiate with treasury board, that could be a conversation that happens at a higher level. So if we want a lot more from our military at the personnel level, we should not underestimate the power that our politicians have, especially those in government, in order to push the agenda forward and promote change in a faster pace.
Charlotte, thanks for your time once again today. Thank you for your thought leadership as well. We here at CDAI appreciate everything you do over there at CGAI. And I hope we can do this again sometime soon and continue the conversation. And like I said, go a little deeper next time. But pleasure to have you on, and pleasure to meet you as well. That brings us to an end of the pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again to our guest. We hope you tune in next time.